The Sony ZV-E1 is a camera that YouTube can't decide how to pronounce, is a Z, Z, and can't figure out whether or not the overheating is actually a problem. Can you use it professionally for video work? What about live streaming? What's the new 4K 120 slow-mo update like? Well, I've got some answers for you today. So no wasting time on unboxing it and flexing its specs because there's a ton of other videos that you can watch for that stuff. What is the scene, everyone? My name is Thaddeus, and I hope that I can help you create something awesome today. If you're a video professional like me who is using his camera equipment for professional work, you've probably already spent hours on YouTube looking up reviews for the Sony ZV-E1 camera because when you heard that it had the FX3 sensor inside of it with the dual native ISO, smooth dynamic active stabilization, insane low light performance in a small form factor body for half the cost, your brain, along with every other digital video professional's brain, instantly went, newbie cam. But it overheats. So you scoured the interwebs, trying to find answers to the questions that you had about whether or not the ZV-E1 would be the right one for you. And every YouTuber and his grandma has made a video about it. I mean, come on, are you even a YouTuber these days or a gear reviewer if you haven't by now? But to your dismay, many of the videos about the ZV-E1 left you still wondering. That's why I decided to make this video to hopefully help some of you make the right decision for yourself. I've had it now for over a month, putting it through all of its paces. And I'm not a professional YouTuber, right? I'm not a gear reviewer. This is not a sponsored video. I'm just a guy who's using this gear in my own media business. For those who want the TLDR, here's what I found. You can get the ZV-E1 to run for long periods of time, multiple hours even. But there's a trick to it. It has to warm up. And to get those long recording times, I didn't need to attach a little fan to it or something. So keep watching to find out exactly how that works. Let's start off with using it for live streaming, since I know that there's probably gonna be a lot of gamers and live stream content creators who are eyeballing this camera. I have to say upfront that right out of the box, the image that you get out of this camera is amazing. Straight out of the box, in my office, which is about 23 to 24 degrees Celsius, that's 73 to 74 degrees Fahrenheit for my American friends, I hooked it up via USB-C, flipped out the screen, and started streaming with it, right? And it ran for over an hour without any overheating warnings. And it finally shut off after giving the high temperature warning at about an hour and 35 minutes. Not bad, right? But most live streamers aren't gonna need a whole lot more than that, unless you're streaming some marathon gaming sessions, perhaps. Now, I let it cool down for about 15 minutes, and then I did a second streaming test. And this was actually where things got really interesting because it just kept going and going and going. It actually went for about an hour and a half before it gave me the high temperature warning again. But then it just kept going still. And I checked on it, it still had the high temperature warning after 3 hours and it was still going. And finally, I had to actually shut it down myself after 4 hours because I needed to get to a doctor's appointment. Now, this didn't make any sense to me, right? Did it just need to warm up? I decided I needed to do a little bit more testing. So the next day, from a cold start, I live streamed a 3D sculpting session that I did on Facebook using the ZV-E1 and OBS to share my screen at the same time for over an hour and 28 minutes with no overheating issues. And then on another day, I streamed an interview for my podcast via Riverside FM, again using the USB-C connection, which actually keeps the camera charged simultaneously, which is a handy feature. This time I wanted to test out my theory about warming up the camera first. So I turned it on for 30 minutes to warm up, just so that the body starts to get a little bit warm to the touch. And then I let it cool for 15 minutes before starting the scheduled live stream. The camera again was able to run with USB-C live streaming for over 3 hours without any heat warning. I had to actually shut it down because I had other things to get done. I've since been able to replicate this result, easily streaming for over 2 hours of podcasting, no problem, with no heat warnings, with the battery door closed and a camera rig cage on the body. I even tried doing 4K streaming after streaming 3 hours of 1080p And I thought that for sure this would kill the ZV-E1. It was still warm to the touch from streaming the 1080p, but to my surprise, it actually streamed 4K for over 2 hours. It seems like all the bad YouTube juju isn't just all it's cracked up to be, at least not for me. Or perhaps I've actually stumbled upon a little bit of a golden recipe for the ZV-E1. What is that golden recipe, you ask? Well, take one ZV-E1, warm it up until it's beginning to brown, then remove from the oven. Let sit for 15 minutes or until just warm to the touch. Then return to the oven and let cook for as long as desired. Okay, please don't put your ZV-E1 in an actual oven when it's on, okay? Not a good idea. So it seems like with this method, this golden recipe, so to speak, other YouTubers have also found similar results doing a similar sort of methodology to it, right? Now, does that mean that every single ZV-E1 is gonna operate this way? I don't know. I only have one copy of it, right? But it does tell me that at least other people are getting similar results. So you can factor that in to your buying decision. Okay, so what about if we live streamed and recorded internally? Surely that has to overheat it, right? Because it's going to be working the camera double. It's going to be streaming signal through the USB-C and then also writing it to a SD card, right? So I started a stream at 1080p, 30 frames a second, while recording internal 4K 30 frames a second as well. As a side note, you can't stream with a picture profile on, right? It just doesn't let you. So your recording is just going to be the image as it comes out of the camera without a profile picture. So no streaming and recording S-Log internally, unfortunately. At least I have not been able to figure that out. The camera streamed the 1080p 30 while recording 4K internally for over 2 hours. Now, it was warm to the touch, but no heat warming. Interesting. Also interesting, this was after I had updated to the new firmware. So I'm not sure if maybe Sony sneaked in a fix or something in this new firmware, but you should probably update your firmware anyways. Let's talk about recording outdoors. You know, that's great about live streaming, but my primary professional use for this camera is going to be as a B cam for paid client work. And, you know, to have a light camera that I can use for gimbal work and for B-roll that can match the quality of my FX3, which I'm filming on currently, that was a real appeal to me. Now, there have been some who've reported that there is a quality degradation when the sensor gets really hot in the ZV-E1. For myself, I honestly didn't really see much of a difference, and maybe I'm not nitpicking it fine enough, but to be honest, for the majority of the work that you're doing and delivering to clients, like the image quality that you're getting out of this is more than sufficient. Also, in terms of it matching the FX3, yes, it's not an exact one-to-one. It's I think the same sensor, but somehow there's a little bit of difference, but it's really, really close, which makes it pretty easy to match the color. I mean, I think if you're got any sort of color grading skills worth your salt, you should be able to match this camera to an FX3 or a A7S3 with no problems. Did some recording tests around the city in the summer. Right now it's the summer. On one of the hottest days, the weather app actually said that it felt like 34 degrees Celsius, which is 94 degrees Fahrenheit. And I was running around in direct sunlight, shooting 4K S-Log 3 at 24 frames a second, at 60 frames a second, 1080p at 120 frames a second slow-mo, because at that time I didn't have the 4K update as yet. I used the camera as I would normally would have for capturing B-roll. Each clip was between 30 seconds to maybe a minute or two, right? That's typically what you're going to be shooting for B-roll. And after shooting for a few hours in the hot sun, I had no problems with the camera. No heat warnings or performance issue. And after a full day of gallivanting around the city shooting B-roll, I decided actually to put the camera through another torture test. So I set it up on a tripod in direct sunlight on that same hot day and hit record at 4K 24 frames a second. The camera was, still slightly warm when I started that recording, and it recorded for 28 minutes in direct sunlight before giving up the ghost. Not bad, but also not great, right? But then again, how often am I going to be recording long form video in broad daylight in the heat after recording B-roll for hours? Probably not that frequently for me. I then let the camera cool down and restarted recording in the heat of the day outside, but this time in the shade. It was just under like an umbrella basically, right? And it recorded 4K 24 for 47 minutes at that time in the shade. So it seems like a little shade goes a long way for this camera. Let's talk about external recording then. So we know that the ZV-E1 doesn't have super long record times internally because of the overheating, especially not outdoors in the heat. However, what about if we gave it the ideal conditions indoors? After all, at least for me, the majority of my client work for long form video is probably going to be recorded in more controlled environments indoors. So I set up the ZV-E1 in my basement office and hooked it up to an Atmos Ninja 5 external recording monitor, right, via HDMI. And I recorded on the Ninja 5 to ProRes, and the camera was plugged in via USB-C for charging. And here's what I got. It recorded 4K 60 frames a second, 422 10-bit S-Log for only 20 minutes and 26 seconds. That was a bit disappointing. So I restarted again to see what would happen after it warmed up for a bit and then recorded the same settings, but this time only for 10 minutes and 36 seconds. I was a little bit puzzled at this point, but here's what happened. Unknown to me, I thought I had set the camera to record 24 frames a second, but the external recorder was recording at 60 frames a second. So the ZV-E1 was actually outputting a 60 frame signal, and that's why it actually recorded less time. So this, at that point, it was when I noticed an oddity actually, that when you have the record media during HDMI output setting as turned on, the Ninja 5 actually will record 60 frames a second, even though the camera is recording 24 frames a second internally. However, when you turn that setting off, you can't record internally to the SD card anymore, but you can still record externally at 24 frames a second. Also, when that setting's turned off, you can't live stream. That was a bit odd, and maybe you should take note of that if that's a concern for you. But I was able to get it to work. So anyways, after figuring that out, I let it cool down fully and then recorded 4K 24 frames a second 10-bit S-Log to the Ninja 5 at ProRes 422 LT for 41 minutes and 44 seconds. Not bad. I let it cool down after overheating for about 15 minutes. So again, doing that same warm-up sort of cycle. So I let it cool for 15 minutes and then restarted the recording to see if that same trick would work. And it did. The camera actually recorded externally 4K 24 10-bit S-Log via the Ninja 5 for over 2 hours. After which I actually had to shut it down because it was late and I had to go to sleep. I know, I'm so weak, man. Anyways, so it seems like that trick works well for long-form videos if you're using an external recorder. But you have to note this. If you don't let the camera cool down enough between the recordings, you're not going to get that longer result. I did another test recording from a cold start, plugged in via USB-C, the battery door closed, the small rig cage on, 4K 24, 422 10-bit S-Log externally recorded, and ran for 46 minutes. Then I only let it cool down for less than 5 minutes and ran it again, and it only went 23 minutes. And again, I gave it only a short break for 5 minutes and then recorded again, and it only recorded for 35 minutes before shutting down. So it seems that you do need to give it about 15 minutes between long-form recordings to get the best results. And this might have something to do with what the ideal internal temperature for the camera is. I found that swapping the battery out and keeping the doors open really doesn't affect the results that much. So if you have the SD card door open, the battery door open, at least for me, it didn't really make that much of a difference. Lastly, let's take a look at the 4K 120 slow-mo out of this camera. For short bursts, recording on a hot day in daylight, it's fine. I recorded some B-roll at a local rib fest in the summer in the heat, and it did really good. Ribs. Anyway, that's probably the harshest conditions that you're gonna get with this hot sun and the hot grills, right? That's a lot of heat coming to the camera, and it did just fine. You're probably never gonna try to do long form video at 120 frames a second unless you're some sort of madman, in which case you need help, sir, and probably some ribs too, because ribs. Let me give you a little bit of a recap and my recommendations. So for those of you who are still watching, you probably were going back and forth between whether or not the ZV-E1 would be the right camera choice for you. And here's my recommendations. If you're a video professional looking for a light camera body with 422 10-bit S-Log capability, great in-body stabilization that you can use on a gimbal or handheld, right, for B-roll shots, or you need 4K slow motion and something that can match the quality of like a FX3 or a A7S3, then I think this camera is going to be great. If you're looking at this as a camera, as a B cam or C cam perhaps for video recordings that are under an hour to match your 10-bit S-Log A camera, generally speaking, this camera is going to do the trick, unless you're in a hot environment. For best results, use an external recorder and the warm-up method that I described in this video. Obviously, results are going to vary though, depending on the climate that you're in. For me, I'm in Southern Ontario in Canada, so I'd imagine that using this in perhaps the tropics might deliver some different results. However, if you need to have guaranteed runtime, maybe you shoot weddings or long-form corporate events, you're better off getting an A7 IV or an FX30. Both of those for a similar price will deal better with the heat and can record 4K 422 10-bit for a long time internally with no problems. Plus, you're going to get that dual SD card, which is really clutch for pros. Now, also remember that this camera doesn't have weather sealing like the other Sony cameras, right? Like the A7 series. So, it's probably not a good idea to take this shooting in wet conditions. At the end of the day, this camera is not an FX3 in a smaller body because that's impossible, especially without a fan. So just don't expect it to be that. I think part of the reason for the hype and confusion around this camera is that video pros heard that Sony stuck the FX3 sensor in a small body and they got excited. But the camera is designed for a particular audience and use case. So you have to set your expectations. You can't be expecting an FX line performance out of it because that's not what it is. And if you're trying to use it as if it were an FX3, then you need to come to terms with the fact that you're using it outside of its design purpose. Once you do that, you're good. If you're a YouTube content creator and or vlogger, which is who this camera is primarily aimed at, then I think this is going to be an amazing camera for you. So I've got it on dynamic active stabilization with the little wind muff on it. How is that sounding for audio? It's a bit pricey for that use case though. However, if you've got the budget, I think this is going to be one that you can potentially use for a really long time, right? That dynamic active stabilization can pretty much replace your need for a gimbal for vlogging purposes. However, just FYI, it does have some issues with jitter when you try to do smooth horizontal pans, right? I think somehow the digital stabilization just doesn't track well horizontally. If you're a live streamer wanting to use this for gaming or podcasts, then I think that this could work well for you as well. Especially if you're in a room that's 24 degrees Celsius or lower, you're not going to have many overheating problems unless you're doing extremely long streaming sessions for over an hour and a half. However, again, if you want to be sure that it's going to run long without shutting down midstream, then just use that warm-up method before you stream and it should perform well. At least that's been my experience. For me, I'm keeping this camera and I've been actually very happy with it. It's a great companion to my FX3 as a B cam and a lightweight B-roll camera. And I can't tell you how many times I reach for this camera over my FX3 because of the small form factor. When I need to just, get out and get a quick shot for a video, it's so easy to throw this in a bag with a small prime lens, turn on the dynamic active stabilization and get some amazing handheld footage instead of having to lug around a bigger camera with a gimbal, right? That barrier to getting the shot is a lot lower with this because of the form factor. So that's something to consider too. And also, if you're gonna use this camera professionally, pick up a small rig key. Trust me, it's a good, cheap investment and it doesn't seem to affect the thermal performance of the camera. It makes the ergonomics of this camera a whole lot better so your pinky isn't sliding off all the time. And actually having an HDMI clamp is really good for peace of mind. That this dinky little micro HDMI port is not gonna get ripped apart if you snag the cable on something, right? Now, I know that the comment section is probably gonna have a bunch of people saying, oh man, you're such an idiot for buying this camera. Why didn't you get this one or that one or whatever, right? And that's fair. I mean, there's multiple options. This is the blessing that we live in a time where there's so many different options, right? And this is one of them. Especially if you live in North America or somewhere where there's a good return policy at a vendor. You can buy this camera, test it out for 2 weeks or whatever, however long that period is, and then see if it works for you, right? And then if it doesn't, you can always return it or you can resell it. right? So don't think that it's the end of the world if you buy this and then realize, oh man, it's not really fitting my use case. I think especially if you're using these cameras for professional paid work, this is just the cost of doing business, so to speak, right? And sometimes you need to pay that cost up front to see if this tool will even work. At the end of the day, these cameras are just tools. This is one of the things that like frustrates me about all of these internet debates about like this camera is better than this camera, than this camera, and this camera. I'm like, listen, the camera does not make the quality content. It's the creative behind the camera. The camera is just a tool. So instead of nitpicking and fussing about the tool, we should be focused on our craft. The tool is just a way to produce your craft. You can have the best 4K, 8K camera even with amazing lenses and amazing equipment and so on. But if you don't have the skill to wield that tool well, it's not gonna matter. You're just gonna have really high resolution, crappy videos. I know that a lot of times creatives have paralysis when it comes to making these sort of decisions on the tool that we're gonna spend our money on. And hopefully this video has given you a little bit more information to make that decision a little bit easier. So stop wasting time, going through all of the threads and debates about the different tools and what they do, and start creating. Like and subscribe to stay updated for future gear reviews, tutorials, and other creative media related videos. Drop a comment down below and let me know your thoughts and experience with the Sony ZV-E1. Is it the right camera for you?